Hello, my name is Creostix, and in this video I will make the argument that Elden Ring falls short of the supposed 10 out of 10 masterpiece it is often and widely claimed to be. It is still obviously a good game, but that is a very different thing than calling it a 10 out of 10 masterpiece in the gaming medium. And before I begin diving in, I feel it should be said that I'm not doing this to upset people or trying to distinguish myself as a unique and special snowflake or to get visibility by going against the mainstream or by causing outrage. I'm making this point because I'm a big fan of FromSoft and Souls games, and I hope that FromSoft makes better games in the future instead of not improving their craft. Because to me, Elden Ring has a lot of problems that seem like symptoms of stagnating or even regressing quality in game design. My personal experience with FromSoft and Souls games is that I have 100% completed all 3 Dark Souls games, a couple of them more than once, and I've gotten all of the achievements, or if you prefer, trophies from all of those 3 games. And I'm a big fan of all 3 of them. They all have their individual ups and downs and small blemishes, but this video is really not about picking apart what works and doesn't work in those games. Just, I'm a big fan of all of them. Let's start with the map and the world that Elden Ring takes place in. So, one of the first things I noticed and raised a concerned eyebrow at was that the map copy-pastes assets quite a lot. Stuff like grids of sarcophagi, ruins of buildings, basement floor plans, that sort of stuff. I understand that a large open world does to some degree have to copy-paste its assets, here and there to fill out the massive world the game takes place in, but there's something very off about how Elden Ring does it. It seems like a clear and very concerning step down from the quality of, for example, the Dark Souls games. Ones that pride themselves in being, master classes of environmental storytelling, and that kind of takes a backseat in Elden Ring because while the environment tells stories in a way that any other open world game does, it really loses a bunch of steps in that regard from the Dark Souls games, where the world doesn't really tell us anything if we see the 7th or 8th identical grid of sarcophagi, or the 12th essentially identical tower, or the 7th identical ruined bit of building. So chances are, if you are in any individual biome, you almost immediately start seeing just copy-pasted and copied and copied and copied buildings, wall bits, stuff like that, and tombstones, sarcophagi, whatever. The large biome areas become, instead of places where the details tell an interesting story, it just feels like you are in this large biome where essentially everything you see is a copy of the thing you see to the left of that thing. The open world, or the size of the open world, seems to me to lower the quality of the game in that it no longer conveys a world, a living, breathing world of details and stories within the environment. It just looks like, hey, it's a lot of these ruins in this bit of forest, or these ruined buildings in this bit of watery lake. And it's just copied and copied and copied and copied. There's still detail here and there for absolute certain, but it very much just loses my interest quite quickly, because everything within a biome just looks the same. The world also reuses the dungeon ideas ad nauseum. Like, a catacomb is always the same thing. Always the same door to which you have to find the same switch, and you get to summon Ash at the end. It's even more repetitive than the Dwemer ruins or Nordic tombs in Skyrim, or one of the other large but in the end kind of mindless open world RPGs. And that's the kind of hole I really did not expect a FromSoft Soulsian game to end up in. The map may have many dungeons, but they just are way deep into quantity over quality. They are always one of about 5 different visuals and copy-paste the exact same half a dozen boss fights over and over again. I honestly could not believe my eyes when I fought my 7th cat statue boss. Is this truly the flawless masterpiece of the developer that made its name in awesome combat and boss fights? Fighting the exact same boss fight a dozen times over in the exact same looking catacombs, caves, or mines. Or perhaps under one of the identical trees, with an identical boss fight under those trees. It doesn't matter how much the lore explains the reuse of bosses, this just is not good enough. If you can't make quality boss fights in your dungeons, then you need to have either less dungeons or more time to create those boss fights. A dozen meh quality dungeons with copy-paste boss fights just creates this vibe of being spread way too thin. A large amount of forgettable content does not create a 10 out of 10. I feel like we learned this in the recent Assassin's Creed games, where the world is huge, and you do the exact same thing in the huge world where the size becomes kind of meaningless. The level design is also leaning more and more cryptic, to a point where the dungeons and levels or legacy dungeons are no longer really an interesting puzzle like in the Dark Souls games, but instead, especially with the inclusion of the jump button, the level design often leans into creating these infuriatingly cryptic areas where you need to jump over these just not too high bits of wall that look identical to each other wall in the area, and there's nothing that distinguishes them from those walls, and stuff like walk on these tiny fragments of ledges about as wide as your foot, and jump and fall between them in ways you can only learn through Google. And these cryptic secrets don't hide just bonus soul items or anything other optional, but actually the legitimate ways to open doors and activate lifts that are otherwise barred. That is too much. It's no longer interesting to explore and complete the exploration of the levels, because it's just truly impossible to explore even close to fully without Googling a third or more. Stormvale is an excellent example of this. You know you missed a number of doors, visible treasure chests, and bottom pit areas with mini-bosses and ways to activate actual major lifts until you Googled them. I know I did, and I feel pretty confident you probably did as well. Another pretty bad example of this is Volcano Manor, where the legitimate way to progress is behind an illusory wall, which means you then have to Google where and what and how to go before going the intended mainstream way to complete the area in even a main story kind of way. That is not okay. Like, hiding the intended sort of main story way to complete an area behind illusory walls is just too much. That is essentially just designing a level that is intended to require Google to even enter, let alone complete. That is not what good level design is. It is just not reasonable to expect the players in a world this huge, in a game this huge, to hit or jump against every single wall in every single major, minor, side, main, dungeon, legacy dungeon, and so on, to simply complete the area in an even vaguely reasonable way, or even enter those areas, because the world is too big to expect that. That is designing levels to be entered or completed only through Google. That is not okay, and that is not good level design. One more thing about the map is that the misleading map doesn't inform you if you have cleared an area, and you don't know if the light waves that are supposed to guide you are relevant to you anymore. So they are as much time wasting as they are helpful. They may be guiding you toward a boss you've already killed, or an area you've already cleared, but the light waves still remain on the map. And since so many of the dungeons are so identical, and you've entered like 12 catacombs and 17 mines, and then you come back after a week and try to remember if you've cleared this one place, you don't know because the map doesn't tell you. And the map also doesn't tell you if you perhaps missed out on some very critical, illusory wall or something that hides a big part of the loot of that dungeon. You will never know, because the map doesn't tell you if you've cleared the dungeon. So the map, while it exists, is supremely unhelpful. And moving on to gameplay stuff, one of the early things that jumped out at me was that any UI event freezes your controls apart from walking. So if you pick up an item or use a stone sword key or something along those lines, there is no running, no rolling, no jumping, no hitting. And therefore, it's so amazingly weird that when you're, for example, using a stone sword key, you've used it, but the UI message is still on screen. You get attacked by a stone gargoyle or something along those lines, and you instinctively try to, play the game, dodge roll, block, hit, whatever. But the game doesn't let you do that until you check off the message from the screen saying that you used a stone sword key or you picked up an item. That is a really odd and strange UI design choice that just doesn't quite work. But one of the biggest weird BS things is that the bow lock-on no longer means anything. If the enemy you've locked onto with a bow so much as thinks about shaking an eyelash, you miss. This problem was not around in the previous Dark Souls games, making you miss with your precious special arrows, or any arrows, for no reason. The bow was always, at best, an underpowered weapon only useful against the weakest nuisances and for cheesing some big enemies if they couldn't get to you. Now it's just nerfed to oblivion. It just feels terrible and makes the combat on its own worse than the combat of any previous Dark Souls games. Like, in the first Dark Souls, if you're in Blighttown, you get the annoying mosquitoes. Well, you can lock onto them with your bow and take them down methodically. In this game, if you have a flying, annoying, weak enemy that is essentially harmless in terms of damage, but annoying in terms of, breaking your poise or hindering your movement through hitting you, you can no longer reliably hit them because the bow lock-on no longer means locking onto anything. You just shoot and it misses because they thought about a donut they would like to get in the next few weeks. Because lock-on apparently is not supposed to mean locking on to anything anymore. And while we are speaking of combat, I feel like a big part of Dark Souls games is that you're supposed to experiment with weapons and try to find out which movement style and weapon actually fits the way you want to play, or if you discover you like a weapon and then want to go with it. Well, in Elden Ring, that's no longer possible, because the upgrade materials are so extremely scarce. the scarcity of the upgrade materials is so severe that it means that when you choose a weapon to go with, you upgrade that weapon, and you are essentially locked into playing with that weapon for the next better part of 30 or 40 hours. Even if you find a weapon that you like the moveset of, upgrading that weapon into being a competitive weapon in terms of damage to your current weapon is just out of reach because the game does not provide you with the upgrade materials to do so with. Like, it's just not an option. The game is so stingy in giving you the bell bearings to buy upgrade materials or to simply find the upgrade materials to begin with to just do that. And if you want to get those upgrade materials, you have to scour through every single tiny catacomb, mine, cave, whatever, which only exasperates the problem of every single dungeon being so identical, with everything looking the same, with the exact same boss fight in almost all of them. It all just adds up into a worse and worse experience. And when you are exploring these dungeons, the dungeon rewards are underwhelming. Sometimes it may be a staff, or sometimes it's one not super useful item, but in many cases, it's just crafting materials that are common. Sometimes a difficult section may lead you to an empty room that has nothing in it. It is just an absolute joke in the face of Dark Souls games, where it really felt like every single, even a difficult bit of hallway, oftentimes in Dark Souls games led into an interesting item of at least being useful or seeming valuable. A nook or a cranny often held a soul item, and difficult enemies were guarding interesting equipment. In here, it's just like, hey, here's 5 of this egg. And you're like, cool, the one I get from every single owl. It simply smells of not being well thought out. The new jump button also seems to have spawned some pretty BS platforming segments which are obnoxious. The platform physics still sometimes cause the character to just slide off the platform you're on, which isn't helped by the fact that the platforms are sometimes more round than flat, like branches of trees and something like that, because just having good game design in terms of where you're supposed to jump and go just isn't what they were going for. The tombs that involve the chariots that run you over are also terrible game design. They're not interesting, fun, or even challenging as such. They're simply endless time wastes that force you to wait for the chariot to go back and forth in corridors that might as well be infinitely long, since getting through that garbage takes forever. There's nothing good there. It's just a stupid joke that wastes everyone's time. They should have never been added into the game. They simply make Elden Ring worse, where the level at every goddamn turn forces you to wait for a stupid chariot. Like, it shouldn't be about this mechanical automaton just forcing you to wait at every goddamn turn for a chariot to go back and forth so you can see the exciting thing of going forward in a tomb of grey. And speaking of whether or not it's hard, it's not a hard game, but the difficulty balance is really uneven. It's this weird thing where it's mostly easy with individual big spikes of difficulty that go back into being easy and uninteresting again. And considering that the open world map is not really a go anywhere map, it's more like a crescent moon where you more or less can map an A to B to C and so forth of where to where the player is going. So there is no real reason for the difficulty balance being so uneven. I too often go past a real challenging area, only to reach a cave in that area that has an oddly easy set of mobs and a very easy boss that feels like an afterthought from about 2 biomes ago, on top of being a copy-paste of a boss I've already fought 10 times over. Speaking of the boss fights, even the unique and high-profile fights have dipped in quality from previous FromSoft games. It used to be that bosses were about reacting to movements and body language that they displayed, trying to get a read from how their hands and legs moved, dodge rolling or blocking with that in mind. That is still, of course, sometimes true in Elden Ring, but it's unhealthily common that instead of having interesting movesets that a crafty player could react to, the bosses just fill the entire screen with area of effect magic attacks that not only make dodging more or less unviable, but you can't even see the boss fight itself. I simply fail to see how blinding the entire screen with yellow light is in any way good or interesting game design. It comes across as just lazy and unimaginative. And yet this issue is also not mentioned in the reviews, and the boss fights are the pinnacle of game design itself. Somehow. And then the story. The short of it is, I think the storytelling is actually really bad. It's still cryptic, but instead of being in the background, the main bosses now without fail have a cinematic in between their fight stages in which they regurgitate random lore and story in your face instead of letting you fight the boss fight uninterrupted. So, FromSoft regressed back from not pushing the story in the player's face. Now they are pushing it in our faces, and even worse, they are doing it as a cinematic in between the main boss fights, breaking all immersion and pace. The player still understands nothing about the story, so the cinematic means nothing. It's only a net negative to the boss fight's quality. It's terrible. This is what we get when no one criticizes games made by FromSoft when Miyazaki is involved. They get horrible ideas that are shit, and then when no one criticizes those ideas, they just make the overall products worse and their game design ability regresses. And the reviews for Elden Ring don't seem to reflect essentially any of these issues. In fact, in almost all cases, the reviews mention no issues at all. Instead, they have these fawning lines such as, "This game transcends things like good or bad video game design." If that is how you feel about this, then you should not be reviewing it. There is no such thing as transcending good or bad design. A design choice is either good or bad or something in between. If you can't place the game on that spectrum, then you are the wrong person to review it. And indeed it seems that almost with no exception, outlets gave the review job to their local Souls fan, who is incapable of criticizing these games, and instead they bend over backwards to redefine great as whatever the new game by FromSoft did, even if the result is obviously a mistake to any clear-thinking mind. This unhealthy FromSoft can do no wrong attitude from review outlets causes all of us to lose, because then FromSoft does not get any useful criticism and they keep repeating their mistakes and making them worse. And this results in a world where we will not get an actual 10 out of 10 FromSoft Soulsian game. Instead, we will keep getting 8 out of 10 games that reviewers blindly claim are perfect. And not being honest about this phenomenon just makes it more certain we will never get the 10 out of 10 game FromSoft is capable of making. And the current review climate for FromSoft games created this very curious looking issue where it was getting perfect 10s basically across the board with no problems whatsoever with the game at launch. Then later, Elden Ring was updated to improve the map to show at least essentially the last known location of the NPCs you've met, of which there are dozens, and they can move around. So, before this update was made, it was essentially absolutely impossible to keep track of where the NPCs are, where you could find them, therefore having any idea of how to continue any of the quest lines. So that was fixed in an update and was not a thing at launch. So it was a problem. Yet, none of the perfect 10 review score reviews mentioned this problem. So apparently the game was perfect, even with this problem, because the non-accurate reviewers did not recognize this problem as a problem. Therefore, the consumers are not getting accurate information on whether or not a FromSoft game is actually as good as they claim, and the team at FromSoft does not get useful criticism on whether or not their game has a problem that they then may have to fix or update. They had to figure this one out on their own. So if they didn't happen to figure out a problem on their own, they would never know it's there because the reviewers in this current climate do not point it out. And this makes it more and more likely that we will in the future keep getting flawed games from FromSoft and even more flawed games from FromSoft, instead of actually FromSoft improving on their potential mistakes or design flaws that they happen to come across, because the reviewers do not mention the problems because FromSoft can do no wrong. That is nonsensical. It helps no one. So before you jump to defend the issues the game has, ask yourself, do you want them to make better games than Elden Ring or not?